This may be controversial, but the Allied Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union prevented the country from collapsing, right? Well, not really, as this has been debated over for years. One side says the Lend-Lease didn't contribute a lot to the Soviet war effort, but acknowledges it would have delayed the Soviet victory by 12 to 18 months. The other side claims that if the Allies didn't Lend-Lease the Soviet Union, then the country could have capitulated. This was apparently admitted by Stalin himself and his top generals. So, who is in the right, and what if the Allies didn't send millions of tons of heavy equipment to the Soviet Union? How would the world look like? The argument that the Lend-Lease didn't do too much to change the outcome of the war is valid, because most of the Lend-Lease arrived to the Soviet Union in around 1944, so when the Soviets were already winning most of their battles against Germany. In 1945, the Soviet Union received 21% of the total Lend-Lease equipment for the duration of the war. This is a bit surprising, as the Allies were aware of that the Soviet Union led the Warsaw Uprising to fail on purpose, so they can put their own Polish government in charge. This should mean that in this scenario, where the Lend-Lease does not happen, perhaps Poland is liberated by the Allies. I'm not here to question whether the Allies should have sent equipment to the Soviet Union in 1945 specifically, as Japan still hadn't capitulated, and they didn't expect 2 nuclear bombs to seal the deal. It was expected that they would need to navally invade Japan and partition the country after that, but this did not happen. The main argument that the Lend-Lease didn't do too much to change the course of the war is that the equipment was mostly sent en masse when already the Soviet Union was winning against Germany, so in 1943, 1944 and 1945. In fact, the Soviet Union got more equipment from the United States of America in 1945 than in 1941 and 1942 combined, which I would say were the crucial moments for the country's existence. In 1945, the Soviet Union literally received 10 times as much equipment as in 1941, which was the most crucial year in my opinion. But in reality, just how large was the Lend-Lease, no matter if there was any impact or not? First up, the Allies in general worked together to send equipment to the Soviet Union, but generally 92% of the sent equipment was from America, with Britain and Canada pretty much contributing the rest. Immediately after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the Anglo-Soviet agreement was signed and British escorts arrived at Murmansk, where they started to train Soviet pilots. By the end of 1941, the British had sent enough tanks that 6% of the light tanks, also called tankettes, were sent by Britain, while 25% of the medium and heavy tanks were also British made. Having these tanks plus pilots in training is something that cannot be neglected, but this is just the first 6 months of the war. By the end of the war, the British and the Canadians had sent 7,411 aircraft, 5,218 tanks, 4,020 ambulances and trucks, and 15 million pairs of shoes. Here is a poster from around late 1943, so in the middle of the Lend-Lease. Now, to be clear, at least when it comes to the American equipment, it was meant to be returned by the Soviets after the war, but for some reason they decided to keep it. I really wonder why the Soviet Union betrayed the United States. Maybe there was a period in history where the two countries didn't like each other, but I really cannot remember. Jokes aside, the Soviet Union actually kept the equipment, but in compensation, the United States got a lot of cheap resources from the Soviet Union, including platinum, gold, wood, magnesium and chromium. But just how much did America actually send? Well, they sent over 400,000 trucks and jeeps, which was really useful for the Soviet Union, and I would explore later as to why. It was a pretty much lifesaver for the Soviet Union. The United States also sent 7,000 tanks, but also 11,400 aircraft. This is all the equipment sent in total, and again let me remind you that most of it came after 1942, so the Russians already won Stalingrad and were pushing the Germans back on their own. To prevent the Allies from sending Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union, we need to make sure that the Act to promote the defense of the United States, also known as the Lend-Lease Act, isn't passed. There are several options to do that. Currently I'm reading this book, The Churchill Testament, by Lord Alan Watson, where it mentions something that I can use. One option is simply for Roosevelt to not become president, but considering his popularity and for how long he served his terms, I will simply discard this option. What I'll go for is the following. William Bullitt was assigned as the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union in March of 1933, but when Roosevelt came to power, he was replaced by Joseph Davis. This is very important, as according to the book I just mentioned, Joseph Davis was the main initiator of the Lend-Lease Act, as he wanted to save Russian lives. Then, after some time, the bill was approved by the Senate. There was also a possibility for the Democrats and the Republicans to work together and to make sure that the bill does not pass. This is possible as the bill was quite controversial at the time, but the most realistic way the bill can fail is if Joseph Davis doesn't become the second American ambassador to the Soviet Union, but is replaced by somebody else. The United States of America in terms of foreign policy was known interventionism and neutrality, due to the Great Depression and most significantly the 1937-1938 recession. Upon the outbreak of the Second World War, the United States signed the Neutrality Act of 1939. This is quite important as, for example, if William Bullitt remained as the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, it could have prevented the bill from passing. This is possible as Bullitt was frankly disgusted with the Soviet Union and their way of dealing with their problems, mass murder and the lack of political freedom. This is not to say that we can completely prevent the Lend-Lease Act, but we can at least delay it by 6 months. You may ask, why exactly 6 months? Well, do you know any significant event in world history that happened about 6 months after Germany invaded the Soviet Union? You're right, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, bringing the United States of America into the conflict. It would have been even more difficult to justify to the public and the policymakers that it's a good idea to send your equipment abroad during a war. The Lend-Lease Act was already controversial before America was involved in the war, and if all happens just like how I outlined it, the bill should fail. It can be argued that once Japan is defeated, then the Americans can send equipment to the Soviet Union. Now I have told you that the Lend-Lease Act didn't actually save the Soviet Union from collapse, but had it not happened, the War of the Eastern Front would for sure stalemate. This is pretty much guaranteed to result in more Allied and Axis casualties, so the Second World War is going to become even bloodier, but is it going to be worth it? Well, let us go to mid-1941, where the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Just because the United States of America decided not to send any equipment to the USSR, it doesn't mean that Britain will also stop, so the video's title isn't entirely accurate. I assume that Britain would still send what they sent historically, if not slightly more, but still it wouldn't be near enough to what the Americans sent for the duration of the war. Since most of the Lend-Lease actually got to the USSR by 1943, nothing much would change in 1941 and 1942, so the Soviet Union still wins the Battle of Stalingrad despite no Lend-Lease from the Americans. I actually did a poll on YouTube asking my viewers if the Soviet Union would capitulate had there been no Lend-Lease. While the majority says that the Soviet Union will not capitulate, they recognize that the front line will just stalemate and become even more deadly. This should work in favor of the Allies, with the power of hindsight, as the Soviet Union will be busy fighting in their core territory, while the Allies would be actually liberating Europe. Still, while this outcome is the most realistic, it doesn't result in an interesting scenario. I want to stick to realism, as Germany would need to do a lot more to win against the Soviet Union. Earlier I spoke about the lack of trucks in the Soviet Red Army, which is actually the most important thing. The Soviets did produce some tanks, notably T-34, so the historical Allied Lend-Lease gave the Soviets more tanks than they actually needed. I will ignore everything else in terms of Lend-Lease and focus mostly on trucks, as there the Lend-Lease actually made a huge difference. Yes, 15,000 airplanes made it to the Soviet Union, which was useful, but I would argue not as much as the hundreds of thousands of trucks. This is because trucks were essential on the Eastern Front for both sides, and I will repeat this sentence because it really makes sense for this scenario. Trucks were essential on the Eastern Front. If you didn't have them, no matter the amount of tanks, any advances would be impossible, or too costly, making them counterproductive. This is because trucks were used to carry food, supplies, ammunition, fuel, just to name a few. Without them, the armies on the Eastern Front would just be limited in size, as stationing a large army in the middle of nowhere, which is the rural Soviet Union, is simply not feasible. For the same reason, tanks cannot operate, or they would be too slow, not being able to take advantage of a breakthrough. This is because if one side overwhelms the enemy, they cannot chase them and secure even more gains, as the advancing army needs to wait for resupplies, giving the enemy time to regroup. In fact, the Soviet logistics, or the lack thereof, was the reason why the Soviet Union lost so many soldiers and land in the first year of the Great Patriotic War. Pushing is going to be extremely slow and costly on both sides, and even the Germans suffered from the same problem, which is the lack of trucks. My friend and fellow YouTuber Rip Lincoln in this video claimed that Germany once offered the Allies 1 million Jews in exchange for 1 million trucks. Some people in the comments argued if this is real or not, but the fact is that Germany was desperate for trucks, while they had plenty of advanced equipment like airplanes and tanks. That being said, I want to clarify that trucks were not required everywhere, just the places where there was no railroads or the tracks were damaged, which is pretty much 99% of rural Russia. Germany can still capture Stalingrad in 1943, as the Soviets will not receive any Lend-Lease and be completely on their own. Whether the Germans capture the city or not, I really cannot tell you, but it wouldn't really matter, I just say that it's more likely. Still, there can be some gains in the Cuban region, but the Caucasus oil fields will not be in danger. The German airplanes can partially destroy them, which can limit the Soviet offensive capabilities. The Germans literally have 0% chance to capture these oil fields for themselves, but they can destroy them as they would be near them. This would give the Soviet Union another bottleneck, as they didn't have trucks to move supplies, but now, even worse, even if there was an operational truck, there would be no fuel for it. I'm sure that the Eastern Front would practically stalemate on both sides, but it would still occupy even more manpower and resources than it did historically. The Germans would also capture a lot more of the Soviet Union, which is important. Overall, the whole front line would stall, so something like trench warfare in the First World War would get established, but the length of the trenches would be 5 times longer than in the First World War. I would assume that the Soviet Union would lose additional 5 million men as a result of this, and with Germany losing about 2 to 3 million more. I think it's time to mention the Allies, who can have extra equipment, but they cannot really use it anywhere. By 1943, the North African campaign was mostly won, so it's possible that the Allies could focus on Japan. The thing is that they cannot put all of this equipment that would have been sent to the Soviet Union in use. This is because the Allies weren't losing ground to the Japanese because of the lack of tanks or airplanes, but quite the opposite. Japan had a huge naval presence in the early war and managed to spark up some rebellions in the colonies, promoting the idea of a greater Asia without any European colonizers. In reality, these countries would have become puppets of Japan rather than the European powers, but that's beside the point. The Allies would start to stockpile this equipment, so it would be decided to attempt a D-Day. Historically, America favored landing in Normandy, but Britain wanted to land in Italy and southeastern France. In reality, both plans were executed and were successful. This time I would assume that with all that extra equipment, an earlier D-Day is possible, but I cannot tell you when. Historically, it happened in the summer of 1944, and I would say that it's unlikely to happen in the winter or autumn in 1943. This is due to the British weather, which is important as the British Channel can see a lot of rain and waves, so it becomes quite risky to do such a massive operation during these conditions. Due to these conditions, the Allies may attempt a D-Day in Normandy around the same time they did historically. The Allies doing a D-Day 1 year earlier also seems unlikely, so let me tell you what I think is the most realistic option. I think that the Allies would still land in Italy and southeastern France, but also in Greece, where they would have a foothold in the Balkans. Only after that, the Allies would attempt and succeed in landing in northern France. Overall, I would predict that due to the extra equipment, the Allies would have an extra foothold in Europe, and even if they don't, it doesn't really matter. This is because I would assume that even if German divisions pull out on the Eastern Front and go west to defend France, that due to trench warfare against the Soviet Union, not a lot would change on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union wouldn't have any offensive capabilities, so the war would really end up with the Allies taking the Axis on their own, while the Soviet Union is still being occupied. Let me remind you that the Soviet Union didn't have any trucks and the Caucasus oil fields were actually destroyed, which greatly limited the Soviet offensive capabilities. Now you may accuse me and say that I'm underestimating the Soviet Union and the Red Army, but I would argue against that. I believe that without oil and trucks for supplies, not a lot can happen. Additionally, there have been the same conditions in the army as the Russian Empire in the First World War, where this front looks like a repeat of the Great War. The similarities are the Russians didn't have the capabilities to push back the enemy, so they were retreating and destroying the land that the Germans would occupy, also known as scorched earth tactics. At some point there is going to be a Soviet breakthrough, due to the absence of the German army on the Eastern Front, so the Red Army will start to advance, but it would be too little too late. In the beginning I mentioned the argument of the effectiveness of the Lend-Lease has two sides. The first side states that the Soviet Union would still win the war, but it's going to get delayed by 12 to 18 months. While the other side claims that the Soviet Union would capitulate. I decided to go with the first option, where the Soviets would take 12 to 18 months longer to reach Germany. This is important as exactly 12 months before Germany capitulated, in May 1944, the Soviet Union hadn't entered any core German territory. They were just starting to enter the Polish puppet state of Germany, and to reclaim Odessa province that was given to Romania. If my logic is correct, we would have a stronger allies and a weaker Soviet Union. So, if the Red Army was late by 12 months, they will not gain a lot of land. I mean, in May 1944, the Baltics were still fully under the Axis occupation, as well as parts of modern-day Belarus. So in May 1945 I would give the Soviet Union the same gains, but the Allies would have an extra landing and start nearing Berlin. Germany would surrender a month or two later due to the absence of the Red Army on their doorstep. Still, the Germans would surrender and the war would be over. In the peace treaty, the Soviet Union would barely get anything. Now I assume that there are going to be some alternate conferences as the ones in Yalta and Tehran between the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and the United States of America, where spheres of influence would be drawn. The thing is that the Allies would perform a lot better, so they can reach as far as Poland, but forcing the Soviet Union to release Eastern Poland, which is modern-day Western Ukraine and Belarus, which the Soviets got in 1939 due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is close to impossible. The same is with the Baltic countries. The thing is that we can take a look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and more specifically how the spheres of influence were divided. This is the first iteration of the plan to divide Eastern Europe among the Germans and the Soviets. The Allies can though compromise and sacrifice the Baltics, allowing the Soviet Union to take all that was promised to them by the Germans in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, including also Bessarabia from Romania. In terms of politics, the Soviet Union will not be able to liberate Eastern Europe, and by liberate I of course mean to replace a dictatorial regime by another communist dictatorial regime. This results in the countries of the Eastern Bloc to be free nations, just because the Soviet Union was too slow to conquer them. Due to the Allies landing in the Balkans, they can liberate Yugoslavia instead of Tito's communists. I didn't mention the Warsaw Uprising, but it can very much succeed, as this time the Soviet Union will not wait for the Germans to put it down before they march into Warsaw. This means that the original government of Poland would return, but they would lose their eastern lands. In compensation, they would be granted large parts of East Prussia and more coast on the Baltic Sea. Still, Germany would be allowed to border the Soviet Union, which is a political move as to make Germany's economy restart and fear communism. Speaking of Germany, I would assume that we would have a restoration of all lands as to before the war, except Italy, who would still lose the Eastern Peninsula. Bulgaria will not gain southern Dobruja, as it was awarded to them by the Soviet Union, despite Bulgaria losing the war. Still, the Axis countries may not be punished too badly, as the Allies would learn from last time what would happen if you destroy a country and demand war reparations. This time, the United States of America would still approve the Marshall Plan and send help to Europe, rebuilding a lot of countries. The Balkans are especially interesting, as we would mostly have the pre-war borders. Just Yugoslavia would gain Istria and Romania would lose Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The monarchies of these countries would assume control over them, but also these countries would get financial help from the United States of America, making them wealthier than in our timeline. As for the elephant in the room, Germany lost a bit of land to Poland, and maybe the Saarland to France, which would be occupied or annexed. Still, Konrad Adenauer would rebuild Germany and regain the Saarland, just like he did with West Germany historically. His government didn't seek revenge against the Allies, but wanted to rebuild, which this time would include Eastern Germany, Pomerania, Silesia and East Prussia. There is still going to be an Iron Curtain, but the Soviet Union would be a lot weaker. Going over to Asia, Japan would still surrender to the Allies after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but most likely the Soviet Union still helps Mao Zedong to win the Chinese Civil War. Perhaps the Korean Peninsula is still split, but the Western democracies are going to have a huge advantage compared to the Eastern communist dictatorships. I recently was made aware that the biggest Bulgarian content creator watches and enjoys my videos before he goes to sleep. So I wish you a good night, Presley. But if you're not one of the biggest Bulgarian content creators, I suggest you take a look at this video, where Poland gives up Danzig to Germany as to avoid war. I hope to see you there.